Test, test, test. Welcome back. Day 10. Bayesian Cognitive Modeling. We're going to get started with a new section today. If you're new here, what we do is we're going over and doing all the exercises in the Bayesian Cognitive Modeling Practical Guide by Michael Lee and Eric Wagenmaker. Skers. I'll learn how to say it at one point, but we're essentially just going through and we're doing a learn along, I guess is the best term of phrase for it, where I read the chapters and talk through the exercises out loud in like a sort of like think aloud paradigm way, and get to practice in real time, hopefully, or this could perhaps be useful to someone who is also exploring these ideas and was looking for some accountability in exploring the ideas together, and or some variation in perspective about some of the ideas discussed in this book. So we're going to get back to it, and we're doing it for the whole month of April here, or we're doing it up until I run out of exercises in the book, and then I'll figure out what else I could cover. Probably something also related to cognitive modeling. I have a few other books in mind that we could do these sorts of think aloud practice series to. For example, maybe something like this one, doing Bayesian data analysis, the dog book, the Kirchhoff's book. People know this pretty well. All right, so we're going to get right to it then. So in our last section, we went over how to do parameter estimation. So the first section, what is Bayesian analysis? What are the principal components of what we're going to be doing here? What's Bayes' theorem? How are we going to be estimating a portion of Bayes' theorem that many times becomes intractable given the complexity of it, that being the denominator of Bayes' theorem. So I think it's should be like page 1 of the book. It says, yeah, the marginal likelihood. So the evidence here, it becomes computationally intractable a lot of times. So we use certain sampling approaches in order to approximate it, so that we can normalize the top portion so that it's representative of a probability, because the likelihood is not a probability. So it looks like chapter, from what I browsed, Bayesian model comparison is really an overview of some of the motivation for why we want to do model selection, or how people have approached model selection in the cognitive modeling sphere, or at least at this time in the at the writing of the book. And yeah, it's going to be really conceptual. So today's going to be fairly different from prior episodes, prior streams, where really we were focused on implementation and just working through interpretation of applied examples. Today's going to cover a lot of motivation for things that are going to be covered in the up and coming chapters in 8 and 9, right? And then moving forward, when model comparison gets used in these case studies, which I'm really excited to get to. The case studies are going to be so cool. So it'll be fairly conceptual today. It's going to be a lot more talking through and thinking about questions that ultimately might not have concrete answers in the end. They can be open-ended, sort of just playing around with the ideas. Let's take a look. Right. So up to this point, we've only discussed a single model. We've talked about how we estimate that single model. Even in the examples like the memory retention cases with the Alzheimer's patients or subjects with potentially with Alzheimer's that were being they were taking a neuropsych battery or something. There was only a single model we were considering when assessing the differences between the two processes for someone who was a cheater and someone who was genuinely taking the examination. But now, broadly in cognitive sciences, we want to know more than a single model, and in fact, we want to compare models because different models, they can represent different things. So there might be one theory who says one thing and another theory that says another, both of which can address a research question of interest, though it's not clear which one is more useful or better representative of what we observe in the real world. So to address those questions using a statistical framework that is embedded in Bayesian thinking, we're going to talk about how Bayesians go about comparing these models, right? And part of the key then, in order to understand these sorts of things, is just touching or bringing full circle back to what it showed on the first page, the space rule. So where we have the posterior distribution, which is equal to this likelihood multiplied by the prior, and then divided by the marginal likelihood, or the evidence, or goes by many names, the denominator. Right. So this is equivalent of saying, what is the parameter given, some data and some model, right? So in this case, we have a specific model that we're entertaining, yet there can be a case where this entire framework is also representative of a second model. I think that's the point that it wants to make here as it enters the discussion about the marginal likelihood, which is sometimes called the evidence. And evidence is a nice name for it, I think. I've heard some works discuss evidence as not being the best name for the marginal likelihood. Specifically, I think Zoltan Dienz in Understanding Psychology as a Science, when he discusses likelihood, I don't think he likes using the term evidence, or at least he cautions the use of the term. I'll have to check though. There definitely was some discussion or debate about it, or there is some discussion or debate about what to call this bottom half of Bayes' theorem. And so here, it's talking about there being a diverging interpretation. So one interpretation is that this prediction observed data. So the better, the more evidence. So I'm going to be good old pencil and papering today, because I went and looked at some of the questions in advance, and it looks like we're going to be working through solutions that involve not implementing things programmatically. And that's going to be the theme for today's chapter, it looks like. And I thought about if I could, figure out if I could do a whiteboard sort of thing. I don't really have a tablet. So there'd that idea go. Right, I couldn't really facilitate, and I wasn't willing to draw things out with my mouse. I think that's just too too tasking. And I'm gonna have more troubles with that than actually doing some of the implementations or thinking critically about the material in the first place. So we're avoiding that. So let's go through a simple example, an example that I think gets used in the exercises. So we have some model with a single parameter. Suppose the parameter takes on these set of values, and then each of these values we can assign probabilities to these values occurring. So that's a reflection of our belief. And what this means then is that there's high probability that the true value of the parameter of interest is low. This is -1. While there's low probability that the true value of the parameter is high, which is 1. So this is our formalization, or it's like I guess we're not formally conceptualizing. No, in some sense it is. So this is a conceptualization of our beliefs about the true values of the parameters. So we get some data, and you compute the likelihood, and you observe these things. So this is the probability of the data, given that we observed this particular parameter value, which is low, and we get that low. Boop and boop. And this quantifies the degree to which the observed data are expected, given a particular parameter value star. So given this particular parameter value, the probability of the data given this particular parameter value. So it's like, how good did this fit what we expected based on our prior beliefs of the value of this parameter? And we have these 3 associated likelihoods. And so then we can calculate the evidence for this particular model. So this is going to be the denominator. Is going to be equivalent to the sum of each of these likelihoods multiplied by their priors, which ends up being this value. So computed by averaging the likelihoods across the parameter space with probabilities acting as average weightings. And notice how just in this particular example, like we had 3 parameters. This is very, very simple case. But even here, like you start writing this out, and you can see how it could get pretty wild. Because we're only considering a case where like a single parameter that takes on 3 values, where in real life parameters can take on infinite values in some cases when we're talking about continuous variables. So you can see in scaling that the marginal likelihood is going to become intractable in terms of just doing this by hand computation. So you state mathematically the law of total probability. I love when you put law in something. That's a highlight, if you ask me. So for discrete cases, like we said here, it's going to be the sum. And then, as per usual, when we're talking about continuous cases, we're going to use an integral. Sum over all the tiny pieces. That's how I remember integrals, is just like counting up all the little pieces. So now we're talking about one of the big takeaways of this chapter is going to be that complexity is a burden for models, in that models that are complex can make a lot of predictions. But amongst those predictions, that doesn't mean that they're good predictions, right? Right. In fact, a lot of them, they turn out to be wrong. So we need to divide the priors across all the predictions in the limit. And that's kind of with the adage here. If you're predicting everything, you're predicting nothing. That's a sort of general like science principle, I think, too, when we're talking about the quality of theory, or you know, or the falsifiability of theory. Like a theory that cannot be disproven is not a good theory. And theories are, in some sense, a model or have model-like qualities. One could say they're models, arguably, depending on your formal definition. They at least should be able to be derived into models or theories. But that's a different discussion. So basic principle is that when a model is complex, is that a model is complex when it makes many predictions. In practice, this can come about a number of ways. So I'm going to I take notes in my book, chapter copy. So I'm going to start looking in my chapter copy so I can start hitting on some of the points that I thought were important during my first read of the chapter. So now it goes over here. It's going to hit on like 3 key ways that models can become too complex. So the manifestation of model complexity in practice can happen in a number of ways. Specifically, models that make a crazy amount of predictions, or prior distributions that are too broad. And then finally, models whose complexity in terms of their functional form of the parameters. So like, crazy amounts of flexibility in terms of the non-linearity of the like function, and it just can capture all possible predictions of the data because it's perfectly fit to this particular instance of the data. This is like overfitting, I guess is what I'm describing here. But overfitting is also a factor to consider when we're talking about model complexity. So closing with that is just the marginal likelihood by assessing the average quality of the model's predictions for this particular evidence that we observe. It's going to take into account the complexity. It's going to take into account these broad priors that need to be accounted for. It's going to take into account the functional form of the model. And in this case, the example it uses to talk about functional form is 2 laws used in psychophysics here and here, both of which make predictions, but one of which is more complex than the other because it can capture more patterns of the data. Right. So being able to capture more patterns of the data makes it more difficult to falsify. That's a challenge because falsification is in part how we move and develop, or it could be argued that falsification is one of the ways in which we develop our theories, move science in one direction or the other. More can be said on that, but let's just start moving through the exercises here. Suppose you constructed a second model from the data, and I'm going to call this model model Y. And it has parameter gamma. I think it's gamma. I don't know what to call that parameter. I always forget this little insignia or symbol means. It's not gamma. It's like lowercase something. Zeta, maybe? It's like zeta. Yeah. Let's go with zeta. So we have the 3 zetas. Now it wants me to compute the marginal likelihood for y. So just following what we did above, we're just doing this, but here with these values. And it's even easier of a problem because zeta can only take on 2 values. So we're just multiplying the value of zeta, the likelihoods here, by these. So we're going to get the probability of the data given the model y is equal to the probability of zeta 1 multiplied by the probability of the data given zeta 1, which is going to be 0.3 times 0.002, and then we're going to add the probability of zeta sub 2 multiplied by the probability of the data given zeta 2, which is 0.003, and we sum those together and we get a value. So we could do 0.3. 0.3 times so we get here. So the marginal likelihood for this model is going to be equal to this. And we're summing, right? Pretty simple. So what is the relative support for the data for model Y versus model X? Well, if I got 0.0027 and we have 0.005, we could argue that this could be like a ratio, so model 1 over model 2. So this would mean that there's support for model 1, right? I forgot how to do this. I just have to think about odds for a second. Odds go in a direction. Yeah. Right, so notice here, no matter how I do this, we have a ratio of the 2 marginal likelihoods. In this case, support is moving towards, so if how odds work, if we had it was equal to 1, then it would be like no support for either of the two models. But the odds are in favor of one model. So you could say something like 44%, or right, increase or higher odds. I don't know if that contextually is correct, but the odds are in the favor in terms of the evidence for this model. Why that might be the case? Well, the second model has less parameters or less possible values. So it's making less predictions. So it's less complex. So that might explain why we're seeing evidence in favor of this model. I guess another point of note is just like if you're looking at the sheer values here, is like this is almost double the size of this. So almost double the amount of evidence, right? And that's also clear here, clearer here, clear here, clearer here. Just in terms of the sheer, like if this is a 2, right, that's 2 times evidence in favor of this model. Okay, let's see. A third model for the same data. Model Z has a mu. Take on 5 values. Here are the likelihoods. Twice as high as the best possible likelihood. Well, what are the probabilities? Oh, okay. Equal probability. That's what I was missing. So these are all going to be divided by 5. 2. Like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 2. So we multiply each one of these by 2, which would be our prior, uniform prior in this case. And then we're going to sum up the values, right? And that's going to give us the marginal likelihood. So note the likelihood for model 5 is twice as likely as the best possible likelihood. So we're going to see here is that this model is going to be penalized for being for making many predictions, I think, or having this broad prior. Either or, we're going to see several of these mechanisms in terms of the accounting of complexity and the marginal likelihood for the size of the evidence. Let's see. I have my book here, so I'm just going to write down these values. It's like 0.1. So marginal likelihood of this value. The general point here is this, as it says, the first two models we had, what was it? Here, and now we're getting 0.001. So we're being penalized for complexity. So this model makes a ton of predictions across a broad range of, and with little specification for some kind of prior information about it, and is being penalized in terms of the ultimate marginal likelihood that is used to get what to call it? Yeah, the size of the evidence, right? Because we're not talking about the posteriors here. We're just talking about the marginal likelihoods. Right, so that's just an instance of penalization for complexity. So consider Bart and Lisa. They get some euros. Bart decides he wants to divide his money evenly. Evenly is key here. 10 candidates, teams. Lisa divides her money over 2 teams, so less broad. 60 on the team, 40 to Germany. Lisa's going to win more money than Bart. And part of that is, so they both have $100, so they have this finite set value. And how Bart distributes his, while distributing it widely across a variety of predictions, doesn't. So think about it, he's breaking all the rules here. It's distributed widely. He's making it more complex in terms of the number of predictions that his model can maintain. So 10 euros for each of the teams. So if Brazil or Germany wins, there's like a slight distribution of his total amount of euros he had. While for Lisa, she's taking on a more risky bet here, right? So it's increasingly more falsifiable that Lisa is going to be wrong in terms of her predictions, and that is going to be demonstrated in the computation for the marginal likelihood in this case, because she's going to have more evidence if her predictions were true. She'll have more evidence for the prediction, right? She should have she would have a larger marginal likelihood than that of Bart, because Bart's marginal likelihood would be smaller because it's accounting for the complexity of both the broadness of his priors and the amount of predictions he's making. So don't hedge your bets, because you're spreading resources is the ultimate message there. Holmes and Watson are involved in a rather simple game of darts. After 5 darts, Watson scores. How do you determine who is the better player? Consider another game of darts, but now one of the players gets to throw 50 times instead of 5. Explain how this scenario shows the importance of averaging instead of maximizing. So Holmes, we could have like model Holmes and model Watson here, and we want to know. Test. Just check my mic. Sorry. So if we summed up the points, and then got an if we summed up the points, Watson looks like a clear winner. But if we averaged, I imagine they're close to one another. 9.6, 2020, 20, 18, 16. Oh, they're not close to one another. It's like 2 times better than him. He's almost 2 times better than him. Well, what's our prior probabilities for each of these events? We'd have to account for that. Additionally, over time, you'd see how it might be the case that Holmes is a better player if we could throw more darts. So with more instances, the data is going to tell us. Let's see. So if I sum these, sheer winner is Watson. But we only have 5 cases. I see. I'm not even thinking about the question in the same way. But averaging and maximizing here. So in some case, if we looked at so these are instances of the likelihood, right? These are the data we observe. And if we just pick the one that was the maximum value, Holmes is the winner here. Holmes scored 38. But if you looked at Watson with respect to Holmes across a range of 5 instances, Watson's the better player. And we're able to deduce that by doing that simple calculation I did earlier, where we saw that Watson's average score was almost 2 times higher. Model would be like 2 times higher with uniform priors, I think. Yeah. And how over time, if we increase to 50 and say we saw the same behavior, Holmes is only going to get worse while Watson is going to maintain some average, right? Because it's possible Holmes is going to hit another 38 or higher score in one of his darts. But that's by simple chance we're going to see these sometimes fairly high values, but this is going to be penalized when we marginalize across the likelihoods. So we marginalize across the data. We penalize things like what Holmes did here to win in the maximization framework. And that brings us to the next point, which is going to be talking about Bayes factor. So Bayes factor is exactly what we were doing before when we did that. That's sort of ratio approximation across the two models, where it's the assessment of evidence with respect to another calculation of evidence. So the probability of the data given some model over the probability of some data given some model is going to give us the odds, which are going to be in favor of one model or the other. And this value is going to presumably indicate relative evidence for one model over the other, which exactly does what we want to do, that being compare one possible model to another. And like many statistics, people over time have bickered about, is this the best approach, or is this a useful approach? And some have argued or even suggest that this could be the standard solution, or is currently the standard solution for hypothesis testing and model selection. And people have even gone further to create these sort of conventional indicators for the contribution of evidence above and beyond one model or another at the various values or ranges of values of this Bayes factor. So Bayes factor for models 1, 2, we could have these sorts of range of evidence, or this would be the interpretation for the ratio in favor of one model or another. Okay, let's see. Suppose you enter same three models. Assume you know the Bayes factor for x and y is 4, and the Bayes factor for this one is 3. Moderate evidence in favor of model X, and then also moderate evidence in favor of model Z or X. So given that we know that there would be more evidence in favor of model X when it's compared to model Y, we can think of model Y as being weaker in terms of a theory or model. And then when we compare these two, it's not clear if there's more evidence for one model or the other. I mean, these Bayes factors are so close to one another. Logically, there must be some principle I'm missing here. So if we want the probability of zy, we have xy and we have xz. And we want zx. So with xy in hand, xy multiplied. From the information here, we should be able to derive zy by I need some context. Zy would be equal to zx multiplied by xy. Zx. But we don't have zx, we have xz. But it would just be the 1 over it. So 1 over xy, 1 over bf xy. No, sorry. 1 over, right, I need the flip-flop of xz, so I need zx, so 1 over xz multiplied by x bf xy. And then the x's cancel. You can think about it canceling. And then we're left with bf zy, which would be four over 3. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So base factor is 4 over 3 here. Because we can just flip-flop this. Sorry, we can flip-flop this, so 1 over this. So then we're left with 1/3 multiplied by 4, which is 4 over 3, put together. And just like, suppose the base factor is mad large. Okay, so one argument, just from reading the question, is that, well, these are relative evidence, so there's nothing about the global properties of these evidence with respect to other models that make them proper. There can be thousands, countless other ways to account for adequacies of the data, and just because with model A under model B we had this base factor that was extremely large, the other model could have just been, oh, that's 2 points embedded in one. So we have this it's the relativity thing here, and that the other model could have been a bad model, or this might be the same thing. So definitely the relativity thing. I can't. That's the big thing that comes to mind for me here. Okay, let's keep moving. I really just want to do, I mean, today's conceptual day, it looks like we're just going to keep going through doing all of chapter 7 today. Posterior model probabilities then. So now we're just extending. Bayes factor compares predictive performance of one to another. It's a complete assessment of the relative model model preference, however, requires us to consider how plausible models are a priori. So now we're taking the prior odds, multiplying it by this Bayes factor. So these ratios of this ratio of evidence that we got between the two models using the marginal likelihoods, and we're multiplying it by the prior odds of each model. So the prior odds of each model multiplied by the marginal likelihoods. The relative plausibility of two models after having seen the data requires that we combine information about the model's predictive performance for the data under consideration. So the posterior odds prior odds, posterior odds. So we have this distinction here where, there's odds between the two models before I saw any data, and there's odds for the two models after I saw data, and Bayes factor can help us convert between these two things. When the prior odds are 1, they're equally likely. Bayes factor can be converted to posterior probabilities. So the model is equal to Bayes factor over Bayes factor plus 1. This means, right, because odds are equal to 1, they're equally likely, so we have this Bayes factor plus equal odds over the Bayes factor. This translates, for example, Bayes factor translate. It's 2/3. Because a Bayes factor of 2, 1 plus equal odds plus 2 of a Bayes factor is 3, and then so it's Bayes factor over 3 is 2/3 for a model given data. Probability of a model given data. In this book, we've encountered two qualitatively different kinds of priors. So the thing that originally comes to mind is something that we've discussed, or I've discussed in my own other work or studying Bayesian inference, which is uninformative or vague versus informative priors. Though the distinction here, I think, is different in here is we're talking about a prior distribution that describes the uncertainty about a model's parameters. And then there's a prior distribution for the data. So we talked about this. When is it? I think in chapter 2, maybe. Or chapter 1, maybe. We talked about procedurally there being... No, it wasn't chapter 2. A prior and posterior prediction. So when we talked about in chapter 3.4, we had prior distributions, and then we had prior predictive distributions. So the two ways that are qualitatively different descriptions of priors are prior distributions over parameters. These capture our initial state of assumptions about knowledge of the psychological variables they represent, so it's our subjective beliefs. However, there are also prior predictive distributions. These tell us what data to expect given those subjective beliefs that we had stated. So this is a distribution over the data, right? So what would the likelihood of, or what would be the marginal probability or the relative probability of any outcome occurring given these initial subjective beliefs we saw? So it's just, let's try to describe the world a little bit based on the sort of assumptions or beliefs that we currently maintain. So there's two levels of prior beliefs here. There's this prior prediction and prior. Next question. What are we at to? Advantages and challenges I'll probably skip over, to be honest. We'll touch on them, but I mean, I'm reading a book on Bayesian inference, right? I'm pretty sold on the utility of you doing so. Consider one model that predicts post-surgery survival rate using 4 parameters. Second model, 2 additional predictors, so BMI and fitness. And then we have these posterior model probabilities where model 1 with the more parsimonious model has this, and then model 2 has this. So for a patient, model 1 predicts a 90% survival rate, and model 2 predicts a 80% survival rate. What is your prediction of the probability of Bob's survival? So it wants me to make a prediction about if Bob is going to survive given the survival rate of each of the two, the predicted survival rate for each of the two models. So yeah. First, I guess, what's 0.6 over 0.4? We use this value, which is the final value. These are the posterior odds. Given data from model predicts, so given D, so given B, given B, or the probability of Bob given model 1, probability of Bob given model 2 needs to be multiplied by each of the posterior model probabilities. So the answer is some combination of both models, right? So it's not that one model might be clearly better than the other model, though. Just thinking to the point of this chapter, the point of the exercises are to demonstrate the value of critically evaluating evidence across multiple or competing theories or models. And so it's going to be some combination of these two that I'm supposed to be considering here. I'm not sure how to average them together. But maybe somewhere in the middle between the two. So now it's going to talk about some of the pros. Just to be clear, I'm coming to, this is a pretty open book question for me. I'm going to say somewhere in the middle between the two values of 80 and 90%. Because it's not one or the other, I guess is the point. This information is probably sufficient to use some technique to draw some conclusion about the prediction for the probability of his survival. And unfortunately, this is an instance we're talking about Bob's survival, right? He probably wouldn't love it. I said 80 to 90%. Could be a big difference when we're talking about clinical practicality. But for the case of this exercise and just moving forward, between the two values is probably sufficient. Not one or the other. Still fairly conceptual chapter, so we're just going to highlight some of the advantages. Why? This is almost like, why are we here? So Bayesian hypothesis testing, it's pretty useful and important. What are the reasons? Well, Bayes factor can obtain evidence in favor of the null hypothesis. So you can imagine you developing or building a model that would predict that there was no evidence in favor of whatever hypothesis you claim, and you could test that model explicitly against the model in favor of your hypothesis, and the relative evidence or Bayes factor could provide relative evidence for one model over the other model. Okay. I have some notes. Another useful thing. Let's see. Second advantage. monitor evidence as it comes in. So as additional evidence comes in, you can imagine that this marginal likelihood is just going to continue to average over that evidence. So we get more precise evidence over time. This isn't an instance like when in frequentist hypothesis testing, because we're looking at long run probability frequencies, adding additional evidence thus changes the needs to be accounted for because we're observing the data again. It's a issue of multiple comparison problem where now that you've added one new piece of evidence, we can shift the probability of this particular hypothesis, given that no hypothesis is true, shifts again. What am I saying here? It's not cool to watch data come in or monitor evidence come in frequentist statistics, but it is okay in Bayesian hypothesis testing. And that's good, or that's useful. So we have this optimal stopping, freedom of optimal stopping. Here. It is entirely appropriate to collect data until a point has been disproven or proven. Continue data collection, likewise. So people who do use p-values can't do this type of technique. And in fact, there are many procedures that we now take into account in order to help mitigate this coercive or hidden degree of freedom in frequentist hypothesis testing, where people can add additional information until their p-value reaches some threshold, because they're like a shuffling of the deck for probabilities and drawing a new, comparing the new data again when you've already conducted a hypothesis test is like is statistically cheating, I guess, is the Wagenmakers. I'm just looking up this paper so we can see. Practice of p-value no hypothesis testing widespread. Yeah, but this is like a very issue that's known now and in the null hypothesis significant testing world, where it's the case that there's a variety of what's the word I'm looking for? There are a lot of avenues for researchers to either implicitly or explicitly interact with their data in such a way that alters the significance or the statistical significance of statistical inferences that one could draw from the data that they're observing, the evidence that they're observing. So what does he call it? And people apparently are not aware of these particular peculiarities of the p-value procedure. Right, and then p-values are never providing us with actual evidence for a given hypothesis. So this this paper is just arguing for or providing some solutions for some of the issues that people who commonly use no hypothesis significant testing might not be aware of. And this is one of the earlier pieces touching on that. There have been more recent pieces touching on the pervasiveness of p-values, and like the p-values piece by, I want to say, in 2011 by Simonson's group. Yuri Simonson, Dan Simmons, right? Those folk. You can check that literature out as well. Okay. We're just going to keep going because this is very conceptual today. So what's the challenge? The conceptual challenge arises Bayesian hypothesis is sensitive to priors. So we know that some of the inferences that we draw when doing Bayesian hypothesis testing are very sensitive to particular priors that we choose. And it's this specific subjectivity that people like to hit on when they're or being critical of Bayesian inference. Low precision creates models that predict any observed results. And what kind of prediction is that? Well, Zoltan's paper or Zoltan's book. So here are some solutions then. So picking more informative priors. So how can we prevent Bayesian procedures from simply reflecting arbitrary precision of our prior distributions? We can have subjective specifications of the priors, so very informative priors. We can use formal rules. Objective. There's no objective prior or uninformative. Every prior is informative, right? But it's like a colloquial thing now. I guess like a starting point that might be useful. Third, one can use sophisticated procedures. Partial Bayes. So there's like a set of procedures that are essentially ways that we can try to generalize or help Bayesian hypothesis testing not reflect arbitrary precision of the priors is some kind of accounting for that, using a portion of the Bayes factor. So fourth, in which I think I'm a fan of here, we can just do simulation, right? And we can explicitly just test our hypotheses across a range of prior distributions and then see when does our conclusions break, under what specifications of prior distributions would we find fluctuations in the inference that we would draw from our hypotheses. So it might be the case I could try like all the uniformative ones, uninformative priors that people talk about. I could try all these. I could try a couple candidates for prior distributions based on expertise or other specifications, and then look how these compare against one another. And just being transparent about the whole process. The computational challenge is that the marginal is hard to calculate. We talked about this. Challenging to calculate. One example computes the so that was the conceptual challenge, and here's the computational challenge. And a computational challenge is dealt with in a variety of ways, some of which, I mean, we've already been doing, where we use these sorts of sampling-based approaches. Right. Just repeatedly. Then we move into Savage-Dickey. Right. No questions there. The simplest classical hypothesis testing framework, one that contemplates two models, so one versus another, a null hypothesis versus a alternative, so equal to or not equal to. And this is specifically when we're talking about a point null, where it's equal to some value, is the null hypothesis, right? So it has to be specifically that value, not some range of candidate values in this simple framework. Features a parameter vector where phi results some nuisance parameter, posits that phi its constraints is free to vary. So we're looking at the two models, and we change slightly one thing about each, and now considered in the limit, H1 is essentially a version of H naught. This is essentially saying that because we're only looking at differences between these things, all the other parameters in the model, as long as we only didn't change anything else, in the limit, hypothesis 1 is looking at the same thing. And we can ignore all other parameters in the model and only compare those two things. So this ratio, Savage-Dickey density ratio, holds under a variety of conditions. And people use it to their advantage. And we're going to talk about this ratio more. So this is just saying, look, so long as the models are nested, I can consider all the parameters I'm not interested in as nuisance and distinctly compare the parameters of interest to one another. So we have 3 more questions here. Relatively sensitive to the width of the prior distribution for the model parameters. Well, that's to account for complexity, right? Where the base factor needs to be sensitive to this, the width of the prior, because of things we spoke about before, where the prior, especially specifically broad priors, are overly or could be considered fairly complex models, and we want to penalize complexity generally in order to in favor of parsimony. And so this can be mathematically expressed by the normalization here, where across all possible formulations of hypothesis 1, right, so if hypothesis 1 is broad, then we're normalizing across a larger range. So we're penalizing for complexity, right? We're going to get a lower value here for the Bayes factor, because we have a wide range of possible instances of these values being equal to one another, I think. Something like that. Bayes factor is relatively sensitive to the width of the prior distribution, but only for parameters that differ between the models under consideration. When models are the same, this is that nesting I was talking about before, where nuisance parameters or parameters that are the same for each would just cancel each other's out in this Bayes factor. So the ratio, you can have a bunch of stuff here, but since both of the things have it, it doesn't matter. It's essentially the point. Main advantage. I would say the main advantage is holding constant all of this nuisance parameters. So even for very complicated models, so long as we're only altering one thing between the two models we're comparing, these can make for like fairly less computationally intensive problems for large complex models, because as this ratio indicates, just because the two models are complex, I don't have to create a ratio that accounts for any of that other information that makes both of these models fairly complex. I only have to account for the small difference between the two structures because of the nesting. That's it. And just important to note that this is controversial. So model comparisons or hypothesis testing in Bayesian framework and model comparisons is this still developing field, and people and statisticians specifically are disagreeing about how to use this stuff or how this stuff gets applied. And we need to use it with care, essentially. So buyer beware and use simulation or sensitivity analyses. One general advantage is that this procedure is going to let us test one hypothesis over another, vibes really well with probability theory, not susceptible to the stopping rules. So here are the main takeaways from the chapter then. So complex models that are models can be considered complex when they make a lot of predictions. They have these broad priors, or their functional form is too complex. That means they can overfit the data or what we observe, and thus those sorts of models are difficult to falsify. The Bayes factor, this ratio between models, is going to penalize models for being these qualities above these complex probabilities. Thus, is in correspondence with this Occam's razor, right? So, or Ptolemy's principle of possibility, which is essentially the razor. So we want simplicity. Bayes factor is going to give us the relative evidence between two models, and we need to be careful about our priors because they can influence not only the posterior distributions, but then the Bayes factors down the road, and thus the inferences that we draw from our model comparisons. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Fair enough. Browse the empirical literature. Do they find null hypothesis plausible? Do you find the null hypothesis? Well, in many cases within psychology, we're going to see that people are setting up pretty, what can be called nil hypotheses, pretty no-duh sort of hypotheses. So they're not putting their theories or their claims under the fire, if you will, for assessing effect sizes that could be reasonable candidates of other possible models for how the world works. Let's see. And could this ever be exactly true? And some people argue, right, that sometimes the null hypothesis is never true and there's always an effect. I don't know about this. But you can have a probability of a null hypothesis being true, and that's something that you can be expressed within posterior distributions and using Bayesian inference. Great. So we've made our way through chapter 7, which was extremely all about really touching on the high points of using model comparisons. And now in the coming chapters, we're going to be talking about a lot of in the coming chapters, we're going to be doing some case studies, or we're going to be trying to use what we learned or what we talked about in the chapter 7. Right, so model selection. Concrete examples is the word I wanted. So here, we're going to use Bayesian model selection in action, right? So we're going to keep in mind these high-level points about the use of model comparisons, and now we're going to go and apply them to some simple cases before we move into the case studies, where this is going to get applied more aggressively in the literature, potentially. Great. And we're going to start with that tomorrow and comparing Gaussian means. So it's simple, like what t-tests do. So it's like the Bayesian t-test, I think. So that's going to be fun. We're going to move back into what we were doing in the past days here. It looks like we're much more working with the code, much more talking through examples. So I look forward to doing that. I hope you have it looks like we went over today, and that naturally happens when we're talking more high level conceptually about things. So I hope you enjoyed what we went over today, and I look forward to starting chapter 8 with you tomorrow as we move into more concrete examples. So thanks for watching.